Okay, thank you very much. This is a honor for me to be here with all of you, Mr. Pramod Kumar, Mr. Vivek Ranjan, and officers and staff of the department. Uh, this is a lecture which is, honoring, as was just told to us, the long history of our independence, and that's why Amrit Mahotsav celebrations. And I thought it is an occasion, therefore, to take a broad historical sweep on some of the big issues of our times, and not just focus necessarily on our country, but look at it from a global perspective, because whatever you do nowadays is a small ripple that blows winds all over the globe. And so it's important for us to take this large sweep of history and try to understand what exactly are the underpinnings of economic growth, and why do we see the type of inequalities that are developing. And I'll end with some types of forecasts which I will attempt to make about what could be the possibilities of growth, economic growth in the future. Okay. Uh, so let me start out by making one strong statement, and that is that if you take a long sweep of history, then you do not see economic growth as we know it today taking place before the 1800s. Okay? So economic growth is a very recent phenomenon. Okay? And before 1800s, across the world, there were civilizations which had growth, but they were always sporadic or they were slow. And they never really transformed the societies with structural change or with new technologies that had dramatic impacts, which led to continuous growth. And historians have tried to understand this phenomenon. And apart from the economic issues involved, they've come up with institutional issues as to why this may have happened. And one of the big institutional factors has been whether the regimes earlier than 1800s were participatory regimes or whether they were more authoritarian regimes. And the reason for that is that if any new industry or new growth is to take place, then it has to upend what was happening previously. And if incumbents are being looked after and are being taken care of by political powers, then it's very difficult for new growth to take place. And so authoritarian regimes, which happened to be there earlier, never really allowed growth to take off in a large manner. It's not that growth did not happen. I mean, if you were part of the elite in those regimes, then you were given certain amounts of freedoms. There was some learning by doing, there was some increase in output and productivity, but it never led to what we nowadays call as creative destruction, which is the essence of growth, which means that growth can only happen if the new replaces the old. It cannot be more of the same, because more of the same can only take you so far. Without any change, it is very difficult for growth to persist. Yeah? So even if you take a society like Greece or Rome, if you take in its heydays between say 800 BC and 300 BC, 500 years when it was really flourishing, you don't see more than a doubling of per capita income. So over 500 years, that's very slow. It's not good growth. And the reason is that even though Greek society, people talk of it as a democracy, it was a very limited democracy. So there was, the whole economy functioned mainly on slavery and coercion. There were two classes of people. There were the patricians who held political and religious power. And then there were the common plebeians who were workers and of course slaves. And power was basically therefore given to the families who held, who were the patricians. And they resisted any overthrow of the government. Military power was very important in order to sustain economic growth. And if a society, went into a period of decline, it was mainly because, again, there was a military force which was greater than theirs, which resulted in that decline. Okay? So you don't really see this, the growth of economies in a persistent manner for these long periods of time up to the 1800s. Okay? Another reason, of course, was that no society before the 1800s invested in what today we would call as human capital or education generally. And that is a big source of growth as well. Okay? And it could just be because it's very difficult to invest in that unless you have the communication technologies to do so. You didn't have the printing press before the 1400s. I mean, the Gutenberg press came in only around that period. Even though the Chinese invented it in around 850, Gutenberg reinvented it in the 1400s, and then the printing press became, more known to the world at large. And that allowed the dissemination of knowledge and information, which did not take place earlier, which was more oral and therefore restricted to a very small section of society who could not have the multiplier effect that would be available if ideas were widely shared through the printing press. Okay? So that could be another reason, maybe, as to why we don't have persistent economic growth prior to 1800s. Okay? After 1800, we know there was the Industrial Revolution, and of course, colonialism played a role in the extraction of resources, which started to lead to economic growth. And then people started to look at it systematically. So from the economics point of view, the way in which people look at economic growth is typically by looking at what are the factors of production that would improve the quality of output or the quantity of output in an economy. And typically 4 factors are listed, okay, which is well known. One obviously is land, because you need a place to grow the economy. Okay? And land, unfortunately, is often taken as being fixed in quantity. Okay? There have been societies which have tried to increase land. I mean, the most recent example would be the UAE, where they tried to grow, coastal areas through what they call the Palm Beach area, in which new business and new residential colonies were allowed to grow off the coast. Okay? But these are very limited attempts. Okay? The second factor that you need is obviously labor. Okay? And this turns out to be a very significant part of the economic growth story of any country in the world. Okay? It's not well known, but there have been interesting books written as to why is it that some countries grew mainly because they happen to have large labor forces. Okay, we normally think of a large labor force as a problem area, right? But if you look at what happened across long periods of time, say for example, if you take the end of the Ice Age, say in 10,000 BC, and then of course, as we know, the world went into 5 land masses. Okay? There was, of course, the Eurasian landmass, there was the American landmass, there was Australia, there was Tasmania, and there was Flinders Island. Okay? And then you ask, where did economic growth take place after that? It turns out that the land masses which had large populations, okay, were the ones which many years later, say 1700, 1800 AD, were the ones which had significant growth. Okay? And it was mainly because they had large populations. It's not a surprise. If you look at the 2 large economies today, the US and China, okay, both of them have fairly large populations relative to the many other countries in the world. Okay? So the US would have possibly about 340 million people, and China, of course, has 1.4 billion. Okay? So size of the labor force is an important factor for growth, because the more people they are, the more people can be put to productive work. It's a very simple concept. Okay? But beyond size, the demographics matter. Okay? So you don't want a labor force which is aged, for example. which is something that is beginning to happen in some countries in the world, and particularly in Japan. In Japan, currently, more than 30% of the population is 65 years and above. Okay? And so they're not in the workforce. And as a result, estimates are that by somewhere around 2050, the GDP of Japan would decline by about 25%. Okay? Just because there are less people to work. And they are quite against open immigration, unlike many other societies in the world. Okay? So if there is going to be a decline and an aging of a labor force, that's going to result in a reduction in growth. And this is a theme that I'll talk about later as well, because it's important when we try to forecast as to what's going to happen to economic growth across the world in the future. The second factor is obviously, the levels of education. Okay? The more educated is a labor force, the more skilled they are, and therefore, the more is going to be the quality and quantity of growth that would take place. Okay? A third factor is attitudes to labor and employment. Okay? If you just look at, societies across the world, a significant difference in employment is along lines of gender. So if you look at female labor force participation, it would be as high as 76% in Nordic countries, somewhere around 55, 56% in the US, and as low as 15% in Algeria. Okay? If you take India, India's female labor force participation has been low. Okay? It's in fact been declining since 1987, which has been a surprise to many people, given that levels of education are rising as well as fertility rates are falling. Okay? And yet, female labor force participation has been declining. Okay? And of course, there are sociological reasons for this. If you look at the data on how we spend our time, it's interesting that this would be well known to all of us, that men spend about half an hour in a week doing household work, whereas women spend 7 hours a day doing household work. Okay? So there is obviously that factor which plays a role. There's also discrimination. Okay? It's well known that women find it difficult to find partners if they or to even get alliances for marriages if they happen to be working. Okay? So these are well documented facts. There are lots of academic studies on these types of issues. And it's well known that norms take a long time to change. So what can you do to improve female labor force participation? And the reason the question is asked is, if you take a simple thing for, say, an economy like the US, if their female labor force participation went up from 55, 56% to 76%, like in Nordic countries, the GDP of the US would increase by something like $1.2 trillion, which basically means that every person in the economy would get $5,000 more. Okay? And that's a significant change. Okay? And so as a result, people are thinking about ways in which you can improve economic growth going forward if this is a restraining factor on the growth process of an economy. Apart from that, there's also very interesting work that we actually see about how the availability of certain types of inputs can change economic growth. We are also used to running water in our houses. Okay? Running water was not something which was known 100 years ago, not just in India, but even in the US. If you look at 1870, 1880, for example, hardly 8% of households in the US had running water. Okay? By 1970, which is 100 years later, that went up to about 92%. Okay? What was the availability of electricity? Okay, in a century ago and a century later, hardly 6% of households had electricity, and then it went up to close to 98, 99%. Okay? What this did was it actually released people from hard working chores that they would actually do. Just collecting water and bringing water to the household was a trip that women did 8 to 10 times a day. Estimates are that it led to them actually walking in a year close to something like 620 miles. Okay? And the fact that so much time was spent in doing such a simple task actually resulted in them not being available for productive work. Okay? So when we think about economic growth, it's the small things sometimes that matter. Okay? It's not the large things. It's not big technological change necessarily. Big technological change is the one that normally comes to people's minds. We think about something that is dazzling, something that has been very innovative and that has changed the world. Okay? The Cambridge economist Ha-Joon Chang, has a wonderful piece in which he just talks about how the simple washing machine has been more transformative of life and economic growth than the internet. Okay? So the fact that the washing machine came into households meant that many people were released from a household chore. And as a result, many more hours were spent in productive work, and he estimates with very careful econometric work to show how that improved economic growth more significantly than the development of the internet. Okay? So small things matter. It's not just the big things which are at the heart of changes in economic growth. Okay? Finally, I talked about land, I talked about labor, but there's also the need for capital, obviously. You need plant, you need machinery. Okay? And one of the issues with plant and machinery is that over time, it tends to get worn out and it tends to get obsolete. Okay? And because of that, there is the heart of economic growth, therefore, tends to be technological progress. Okay? The rate at which you replace worn out capital and the rate at which you replace it not with the same, but with better quality and better ingredients which make the quality of growth very different. One interesting factor that has happened recently about capital is that we've been sort of conditioned to think of capital as plant and machinery. But a lot of the recent growth of capital is what I may call as intangible capital. Okay? Just look at our recent history. If you take the time when we went through COVID, okay, a big issue at that time was, are there PPE sets? Is there oxygen availability? We were looking at hardware. Okay, is these types of things important? Are hospitals equipped enough? Okay, these were the questions that actually were asked about our ability to get around the pandemic. Okay, but if you look at what was the most significant thing that allowed us to get around the pandemic, it was actually the development of the vaccine. Okay, now vaccines are vials. They involve needles, they involve physical inputs, okay? But most importantly, you cannot have a vaccine without know-how. And know-how is an intangible, okay? It involves years of R&D. It involves a lot amount of work in clinical trials, where finally the vaccine comes out, and that is really the ingredient that actually finally is known to have got us out of the pandemic. Okay? So intangible capital has been a big growth factor in the last 20 to 30 years, which has explained growth across the world. Okay? And intangible capital in, say, drugs and pharma would just be simple, patents. And, for those companies, it is that, which is more important. It's not, the physical laboratory or the factory space, which actually just supports the science and R&D to bring out new drugs which help us increase our longevity and our lifestyles. Okay? It's well known that part of the recent economic growth phenomenon has really been about us having better health and longevity. Okay? If you just take from the time of independence in India to today, okay, the lifespan of people has increased significantly. Okay, and a lot of it has got to do with modern medicine and the growth of intangibles. Okay. Intangibles is also important, not just in high-tech industries. Again, we just think of it as high-tech. It is very important even in the old industries. Think of Coca-Cola. What's its most important asset? Its brand. Its brand is an intangible. Okay? The actual secret formula that makes Coke is so cheap, it doesn't mean anything to them. Okay? It's the brand which gives them value. Okay? If you look at the accounts of Microsoft, okay, it's very interesting that the investment that they have in physical capital, okay, turns out to be nothing more than about $3 billion. Okay? And that is just, about 1% of its market value. Okay? And it's about, 3% of its assets. So it's really intangibles, which is the source of, the importance of these organizations, and which has been the big change factor that has influenced economic growth in the recent past. Okay? As a result, you've actually had, the growth of what we now call, two groups of conglomerates, which have started to get a lot of attention across the world, including in India. One is the group of companies known as the FANG, okay, which is Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, the FANG, and in China, known as the BAT, which is Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. Okay? And all of these conglomerates have really grown on the basis of investments in intangible capital, which is very different from the plant and machinery that we have normally been used to associating with economic growth. Okay? So growth has many benefits. Okay? It's improved, as I said, our longevity. It's improved, given us better health care, possibly better food. It's, given us smartphones, plasma TVs, many things that we enjoy today. Okay? What are its costs? Okay? Simon Kuznets, who was the person who invented national income accounting, okay, was the first person to be most aware of the costs of economic growth. Okay? And one of the first factors that he talked about in the early 1950s, okay, was that economic growth is going to be associated with inequality. And he bothered a lot about that. And the reason for it was that when economic growth happens, some change is going to take place. Some technology, new technology is going to be made available in a society. Who are the people who can work with a new technology? Kuznets argued that it was basically people who were skilled, people who were educated, because they would have the flexibility to work with new types of inventions and new types of plant and machinery. Okay? As a result, the return or the income that those people earn would grow and inequality would increase. Okay? He was, however, sanguine, and he argued that over time, people who lost their jobs because of these new technologies would try to invest in the skills and education required, or would push their children to invest in that. And over time, maybe inequality would decline. So there is a very famous hypothesis which Kuznets put out, which was that in the early phases of economic growth, inequality rises because of the complementarity between the skills that are required to source new growth. And after a period of time, he argued, inequality will decline. Okay? There have been literally thousands of papers written on this hypothesis. Okay? People looking at it across various countries. And by and large, they found it to be true that if you take a long span of history, inequality did rise, and it started to fall till about the mid 1990s. Okay? But after the 1990s, somehow the hypothesis did not work. Okay? And people tried to understand, why is it that inequality rose even more substantially than it was the case earlier, and why are we having this new wave of inequality that is taking place? Okay? So one of the big reasons that Kuznets actually talked about was, of course, technological change. Okay? And he argued that this happens in discrete waves, okay? Which is true. Any new technology, comes up because of some general purpose technology. Today, what we call as GPT, since Chat GPT has become very famous nowadays, okay? But a general purpose technology is really the heart of technological change. If you look at, say, the Industrial Revolution, the general purpose technology that was there at that time was basically steam technology, right? Steam engines came into being. They actually drove, shafts in factories, and most, motors were actually held, attached to, these shafts through some sort of a belt. And so there was a centralized steam engine which actually drove productivity throughout a factory. Okay? Over a period of time, the electric motor developed. Okay? That became the new GPT. Okay? And that allowed actually that each of the components of whatever was being produced could actually be organized in its own space without reference to the main engine, which used to be the steam engine earlier. Okay? And that enabled new growth. Okay? So every phase has had it. In our phase, possibly the GPT is semiconductors, okay, which has led to the growth of computation and has led to the growth of AI and robotics. Okay. Before I get into the technological specificity of it, I should mention two other factors that are important in generating inequality across the world. Okay? And they are endemic to the way in which we operate and the way in which we actually go about our economic lives. One is the growth of international trade. Okay? Everyone looks at trade as beneficial. It has benefited countries, but it benefits countries unequally. And the reason is that international trade increases the return of a country to the factor that is abundant in that country, right? And so if you happen to be a country which has more educated persons, okay, compared to other countries in the world, that country through international trade will start to have higher levels of incomes compared to the others. Okay? A simple factor that some of us were talking about just yesterday was if you look at what is the value of a shoe that has been manufactured by Nike. Okay? If you look at the cost of the shoe, only 3% of what you are wearing as a Nike shoe is the actual manufacturing cost of the shoe. Okay? 97% is design, is technology, is basically R&D being done by a small group of people sitting in the Nike office in the US. All the production of the shoes takes place in Southeast Asia, and the whole cost of the shoe is just 3%. Okay? 97% is going into R&D costs. Okay? And that is sort of telling us that the educated people who are sitting in a particular country are reaping the returns of the international trade that is taking place, even though every one of us gains, okay, as a result of being able to wear and buy a comfortable shoe. Okay. The second reason international trade creates inequality is because of location. Okay. So if you were in China, for example, and you happen to be along the coastal belt, the chances would be higher that you would actually get higher incomes than if you were in an internal part of the country, just because the coastal belt was more keyed into trade. Okay? So location and skills happens to be one of the big reasons why international trade has led to a rise in inequality. Another reason for the rise in inequality is what we call as the superstar dynamic. Okay? I mean, we've just seen how Pathan has been a film which has actually raised, the largest amount of revenues in Indian cinema. Okay, and it's just this what is known as in business as the superstar effect. Okay, which is that typically some people with the highest level of quality, okay, are valued much more than a person who could be almost as good, but people somehow do not want to witness that person as much as the superstar. Okay? And modern technology has made it able to broadcast the effects of the superstar at a very low cost across large sections of the population, which wasn't the case earlier. And so you see the superstar effect, not just in films, but in sports, okay, where the top quality person earns significantly more than a person who's just a notch below them. Okay, you see it in law amongst lawyers, and you see it among CEOs and top management professionals. Okay, and the reason is just that the rise in inequality that we're seeing is because people's preference for either being entertained or being served or being, looked, or for organizations being looked after by certain categories of people is given that much more of a value than the fact that there are many others who are involved in that process but are not given the type of value that would otherwise be attainable to them. Okay? So leaving aside these two factors, the growth of international trade and the superstar effect, which have contributed to inequality, let me also quickly talk about two other factors which have been as a sort of bump on the road to growth. Okay? One is what is called as the Easterlin paradox. This is a very interesting paradox where a person named Richard Easterlin found out that in many countries, as economic growth takes place, people benefit and people are happy. But there happens to be a turning point after which somehow people don't be as happy with growth. Okay? So he did extensive studies in Chile, in China, South Korea, okay? And he found that in the initial phases of growth, happiness increased. Okay? But after a certain point, happiness decreased. Okay? And it became known as the Easterlin paradox. Why is it that when we have more, we are not as happy? Okay? And of course, there are some very simple reasons for it, but it's still a problem that people are trying to unravel. The simple reason is that if growth takes place, and let's say my income increases, and I have the ability to buy a car, I'm very happy. I now have this mobility at my fingertips. Okay? But as income increases more, and I buy a second car and a third car, it's not going to give me that much of a kick, okay, as the first car did. Okay? And so happiness is not something that's going to necessarily increase ad infinitum. It increases up to a point and then it declines. Okay? Easterlin did a number of studies across countries asking people what made them reduce their happiness as their income levels went up. And the interesting answer that came up was that people were feeling that they lost solidarity. They lost the ability of friendship. They became more anonymous. They became more cogs in the world of work. They were not defined by their leisure time and by their ability to be with friends. Work took over their lives, and so they lost their happiness. Okay? So economic growth is, again, a mixed bag, okay, because of that. The second issue, which is a bump on economic growth, okay, which can be a roadblock to economic growth, is talked about a lot, so I'm not going to talk about it, and that is in the environment. Okay? The more we grow, the more we use resources. The more we use resources, the environment is going to be impacted. Okay? And excessive growth can actually bring about the destruction of the natural world. Okay? There have been wonderful work done historically on this, not just in our present circumstance. There is this beautiful island called Easter Island, which is off the coast of Chile. And somewhere around 200 years ago, it was a prosperous island. There must have been something like more than 20,000 people on it. Okay? And in order to fish, the population started to cut down the trees in order to make canoes and go fishing. Okay? After a point in time, the number of trees on the island diminished. Okay? And then they had to live off the animals of the island and the produce of the land. But the fact that the trees had been cut meant soil erosion took place. The productivity of the land fell. So much so that 150 years later, the population declined from more than 20,000 to as low as 2,500 people. Okay? And it was on the verge of extinction just because of environmental degradation. Okay? So let me sort of set that aside. So I talked about two things other than technology that can impact inequality: international trade and the superstar phenomenon. I talked about two bumps on the road to economic growth. It need not bring us happiness, okay? So we should be circumspect. And the fact that it could actually result in impacts on the environment, okay? Let me go back to the relationship between technology and inequality, okay? If you look, again, take long spans of history, it's very interesting to see that, growth, many changes took place almost by a factor of 10, okay? So if you look at, when did hominids come into being, okay? This is something like, 10 million years ago, okay? When did Homo erectus come into being? 1 million years ago, so factor of 10. Not really one, a little more than that, about 1.5, but still around a factor of 10. Okay. When did Homo sapiens come into being? Okay, 100,000 years ago. Okay. And then after that, agriculture. Agriculture was 10,000 years ago. Okay. And then the most significant thing after that, as I said, was the printing press. And I date that around 1,000, okay, years back. And then finally, electricity. Benjamin Franklin around 1750, okay? And finally, the growth of the internet around 1990, okay? And then suddenly, things started to change. The world started to become more digital, just as earlier, after electricity, the world was more electric, okay? Now, the interesting fact about the world becoming more digital is that it changed the world of work and it changed employment patterns, okay? It was easy to digitize some parts of the economy and not easy to do it in other parts, okay? So it was found that in work which was low wage, okay, you could not digitize so easily, okay? And the reason is that many of the people in that type of employment were doing what we call as unstructured work, and basically it involved unstructured social interaction, okay? So just think about janitors, for example, okay? If someone has to go around, cleaning a room and the room has uneven surfaces, it's very difficult to digitize something like that, okay? You would notice that robotics only takes off in warehouses which are absolutely flat and well planned, okay? In places which are not being planned for that, it is very difficult to, digitize and to actually make sure that those jobs will be replaced, okay? Think about, food, the cooking of food, or think about, serving, or think about security services. These involve unstructured social interaction. And so again, it is not very easy, for technology to replace those jobs. If you look at jobs at the high end, again, it's very difficult to replace, okay? Because there, what is not easy to structure is the cognitive interaction that is involved, okay? These are jobs which involve problem solving, creativity, and of course, if you are, top management, it also involves persuading others to do what is important for the organization. Again, it's very difficult there, okay, to digitize. So a lot of the jobs in the middle actually got digitized, okay? And this is called as the hypothesis of job polarization, that people who had blue collar jobs, people in the middle started to lose their jobs. And this was really the heart of the people who supported someone like a Donald Trump when he, stood for presidency, because they all lost their jobs because of the automation and digitization that was taking place in the middle levels of society, okay? Those at the lower ends did not get as impacted, and those at the higher ends also did not get impacted, okay? And so as a result, this had implications, okay, for the economy and for growth, okay? To put it very simply, let me just give you a sort of a snapshot of an economy which has, let's say, just two sectors, okay? Let's call them sector A and sector B. You can think of this as agriculture and manufacturing. You can think of it as any two sectors. Let's say 100 people are employed in sector A and 100 are employed in sector B. Okay? And now some new technology comes which actually replaces all the 100 people in sector A. Okay? So you can produce the output of sector A without any people. Let's think of an economy like this. So what would happen is the people in A would necessarily need to go to B, right? And they would take time to migrate. Let's say it takes 50 years to do that. Okay? This is not very different from how, for example, over the 20th century, people migrated out from agriculture to industry. Okay? If you take, the developed world, around 1890 in the US, maybe about 75% of people were in agriculture. By the end of the 20th century, just 4%. Okay? If you look at India, okay, at the time of independence, maybe about 60 to 65% of people were in agriculture. Okay? That has gone down to about 45%, even as the share of GDP, which was 60% at independence, is now just 14% of agriculture today. Okay? So it takes about that amount of time. So let's say these 100 people took about 50 years to move out. Okay? And now all the output is being produced in sector A without people. Okay? But in sector B, we have 100 more people. Okay? So 100 units of output got produced in sector A and now 200 units in sector B. And so GDP has gone to 300 as a result of this technological change. If you ask yourself, what is the growth rate? It turns out to be very measly. Over 50 years, 200 to 300 is nothing. It's less than 1% of growth. Okay? So technological change has this ability to change the dynamics of an economy, but does not necessarily lead to growth. Okay? Now, if you think about the people who did all the software and digitization in sector A, and let's say they kept half of the output for themselves, okay, because they happen to be the owners of that. So suddenly their share of output has grown, okay, from say 0 to 50, okay. And that means that inequality is now grown very significantly, okay, whereas economic growth has not taken off as much. Okay. So the lesson for us from digitization, which is the current economy, is as follows, that digitization replaces jobs, as I said, due to job polarization. It hollows out the middle. Okay? It basically replaces labor. So think of it as, there is an addition to labor coming from automation, which is not necessarily labor in itself. Okay? But if you think of it, effective labor supply has increased. If effective labor supply increases, wages fall. And that's what we are seeing across the world, okay? That in many aspects of the economy, the share of wages in the economy has declined and profits have increased, okay? Now, as wages fall, the demand, okay, for higher wages is obviously falling. Prices are also going to be falling with the rise in productivity. And what does a central bank or a finance ministry do in such a circumstance? You have no option but to reduce interest rates. So you've had historically low interest rates over the last 20, 25 years compared to the previous 50 years. Okay? And that has resulted in market valuations which have actually given us the ability to see a lot of seesaw in the stock markets. So some of the empirical work that has been done shows that if you look at market capitalization, then just 1/3 of the change in market value that has taken place has been because of the increase in profit. 2/3 has just been because of the decline in interest rates. Okay? Because if you think of it, very simply, the price of a share is nothing but the present value of its future dividends. Okay? And the dividends reflect profits. And the present value means you're dividing by an interest rate. And an interest rate which is declining basically means present values are going up. So 2/3 of valuations have just got to do with declining interest rates. And declining interest rates have got to do with the fact that there has been digitization, which has reduced wages, and the increased productivity, which has resulted in inflation not going as much out as it used to be in the previous 50 years. Okay? So this is a phase, therefore, of increased digitization, increased inequality, and the question that I now want to end with is how much what sort of impact can it have on growth going forward in the future? Okay, and for lack of time, I'm going to actually just take a very quick snapshot again of history in order to help us inform ourselves about what may happen in the future. Okay, so just think of a simple family which was there in the 1870s. Okay, it would be a family in a rural area. You would have to take care of your own needs. There would be no communications. There would be no postal service. There would be no telephones. Okay, if you had light in the night, it would be from a candle. If you were lucky, if you were in the western region of the world, you would actually be using possibly whale oil. Okay, and the tallest building that you would ever see in 1870 would basically be one floor. Okay, switch to 1920. Okay, there has been some electrification. Okay, some people have access to electricity. The difference between 1870 and 1920 is some fraction of households, 1/3 to be precise, in the advanced world, started to get access to cars. Okay, otherwise everyone was using horses for mobility. Okay, uh, you know, those who had access to electricity found their lives improved. Okay, the luminosity of electricity is 10 times more than kerosene lamps, which was being used. Okay, in my childhood, I've actually lived with kerosene lamps, and it is 100 times more than a candlelight. Okay, so it really changed lives. Okay, and slowly you started to see, buildings which were taller. Okay, the first skyscrapers started to emerge. Okay, if you go from 1920 to 1970, you see many more significant changes. Okay, televisions came into households. For the first time, you had households having actually access to flush toilets within their homes. This wasn't there even in the 1920s, even in the advanced world. Okay, if you wanted and you had the ability, you could actually, go across the world in an aeroplane. Okay, your television set allowed you to see a person landing on the moon. Okay, so significant changes happened. Okay, but between 1970 and 2020, you don't see much change. Okay, what has really changed for a household? People still have cars. Okay, they are a little more safe and maybe a little more environmentally friendly. Okay, the speed of aircraft has not changed. Okay, Concorde was given up in the 1990s. Okay, because it was too fuel intensive. The only new thing that came into households across the world was microwaves. Okay, and you started to, of course, get plasma TV, and you started to get smartphones, but you didn't see a significant change in productivity as you saw through the 20th century. Now, what drives productivity a lot is R&D. Okay, and what we've been finding is that across the world, the investment in R&D, okay, in terms of the number of people who are doing R&D, has not been growing in the last 30 to 40 years, unlike what it was earlier. Okay, and this has become a significant factor in the decline in productivity that we are seeing. Even in the US, measures of productivity have been declining over the last 30 years. Okay, now the answer to that obviously is to throw more people in the job of R&D. Okay, and here's where I'll end with a sort of a long shot. Okay, and the long shot is, to throw more people into that, you need more people. And what are the forecasts for population going forward? Okay, it's very interesting that despite the doomsday that the environmentalists are, have been pushing at us, the fact of the matter is that demographers tell us very clearly that human populations are going into decline. Okay, by the year 2100, okay, there are many countries which will have half the population they have today. Okay, in fact, the demographers count more than 24 such countries. And these countries include Japan, Spain, Thailand, and a number of others. Even China, in the year 2100, will have a population of 730 million. okay, significantly down from its 1.4 billion. Okay, so if there is going to be lower populations in the future, okay, and that has been the trend, okay, as fertility rates have been falling. So as people get richer, there are smaller populations. They get less happy also, as we saw, okay, and as a result, there will be less people to throw into R&D, okay. The question then, which is open for for debate, and there are no easy answers to that, is will technological change continue or will it die down? And then the only answer for its continuation is if somehow automation takes over and does the work that humans do today. So if we ever have artificial general intelligence, that may do the R&D that scientists are doing today. Okay? If we don't, then growth, just like prior to the 1800s, may end after 2100. So it may just be that in human history, for 300 years, you had this long push of growth, but after 2100, we may go back to a period of the past. Okay? This is not unknown. This is something that historians call as efflorescence. Okay? If you ask, in the Middle Ages, which was the society which had the most scientific change, it was actually the Islamic world. Okay? They were the ones who, along with India, of course, developed the numeral system. But more than that, for the first time in the 11th century in Baghdad, people got to understand the physics of magnifying lenses. For the first time, an automaton was developed in the 11th century. For the first time, you actually had, new inventions like the ability to lift water by using mechanical energy. Okay, all that suddenly died out in the 12th century. Okay, and so you had a sporadic period of growth which went away. Okay, will we go through a similar process? Is the question I want to leave you all with. It's easy to make prognosis, but as I said, the science is very clear. The science tells us that there is going to be, less population. There's going to be less R&D. Only if that gets substituted by some other factor which will create that R&D will growth take off. Otherwise, we are in a period where we may see changes which have not been historically unlike what societies have seen earlier. And of course, everyone adapted to it. So I don't think it's going to be something that will be catastrophic in any sense of the term. Okay. So let me end at this point. I thank you, for giving me this opportunity. It is a period of significant change, large growth in inequality, a sort of a bump in growth, but with many things that we need to keep in mind about the possibilities of growth in the future. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for such engrossing lecture. And really, we understood so well the current situation, and not once was there a non-interesting moment, sir. And should we say the superstar effect or whatever? I now call upon Srimati Sweta Madam, Ms. Sweta Pachori Madam, Joint Commissioner, and Gandhinagar Commissioner.